Sean Hook's Newsmaker Saturday starts now.
Thanks for joining us on Newsmaker Saturday. Later in the program, we will be joined by Phoenix Police Chief Jeri Williams talking about recent ambush attacks on police officers in Phoenix and how this is affecting attracting police recruits in this city. But we begin the program with Arizona Congressman Ruben Gallego, who has a unique perspective on the Russian invasion of Ukraine because he is a Marine who served in Iraq. He represents Arizona's 7th congressional district, which is most of southern, western, and downtown Phoenix, along with portions of Glendale. Congressman Gallego, thanks for being with us on Newsmaker Saturday.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, you know what it's like to sacrifice blood and treasure on a battlefield. Not that we're sending troops over there to Ukraine, but how far should the U.S. go in your view?
Look, what I see right now, we should continue to reinforce our Ukraine partners with the weaponry they need, with the intelligence that they need, and continue to support them on diplomatic and economic sanctions against Russia. If we continue doing this and we sustain that, in the long run, Ukraine will win this, and we don't have to spare or put in any of our men or women into harm's way.
You know, you're joining now a chorus of people who are thinking Ukraine can actually win this. That's a strong statement.
Well, I think Ukraine can win this in the long run. This is not an immediate win, but a country the size of Ukraine, which is the size of Texas, with about 44 million people, maybe 40 million people now with some refugees, you're never going to be able to take them over. And we've seen already the resistance that's happening here. It's a democratic country. They don't want to be under autocratic rule from Russia. In the long run, whether it's 2 months, 3 months, or a year, Russia will not be able to hold Ukraine. Maybe they'll be able to hold portions of it, but in the long run, they've already lost their initial goal, which is to take Ukraine as a whole country and to dominate it.
So you know about Afghanistan and their experience there. It's the place where empires go to die, as we've been told. Do you think this starts to look a little more like Afghanistan in the long run for Russia?
I think this is worse than Afghanistan. Russia lost 15,000 men over 10 years, roughly, in Afghanistan. We estimate that with some of our intelligence and our intelligence partners, that a minimum in the 1 month engagement, Russia has lost close to, on the conservative side, 7,000 men. On the not conservative side, 15,000 men. That's only over 1 month. So this is actually looking to be a lot worse than that. And also, Russia itself is not the same as it was back in the late 80s. It is a country that is more integrated to the West. Economically, it's more dependent on the West than ever has been. And it's paying massive consequences both on the battlefield, but also at home.
Congressman, step back for a minute. Why should Americans care about what is happening in Ukraine?
Look, I think it's important for us to care for a couple of reasons. Number one, it is a democratic country that has chosen to stay democratic, and it's being invaded by another autocratic country, something that is very dangerous that if we allow it to happen can set off some consequences all over the world that would find ourselves eventually being involved in. Number two, massive land wars in Europe tend not to favor peace. We have set up a system of peace and alliances and just understandings to make sure that we avoid massive land wars, because that's how we ended up ourselves in World War I and World War II. And if we allow Ukraine to fall, I do not see Russia ever stopping. I think they will continue to go further west and potentially put ourselves in a situation where we will find ourselves in a shooting war. And lastly, morally speaking, we have to understand that this is a right and justified war that the Ukrainians are fighting. And we, as a democratic leader of the world, should back them in every way possible, except for, obviously, as I said before, troops.
How about airplanes? I mean, the Pentagon rejected this idea of sending Russian fighter jets to Ukraine through the U.S. and that we'd be kind of an intermediary. They've scotched that idea. Do you think we should give them planes and more aggressive hardware?
I do think we should be giving them planes. There is a precedence for this. Russia gave North Korea jets to fight us during the Korean War, gave the North Vietnamese jets to fight us during the Vietnam War. So I think there is something to be said that we can actually also arm with the Ukrainian people, or the military, I should say, without escalating this into a higher level. I also think that we should be getting more sophisticated air defense missiles for them to actually defend themselves, especially around huge population centers. And I think that would end up being even more productive than MiGs. But if Ukraine is defending itself and they're asking for this type of weaponry, we should give it to them, and we should give it as fast as possible.
It's pretty clear we've got an unholy alliance building between Russia and China. And you've spoken about this, that maybe Russia has exposed themselves as not being as adept on the battlefield as everybody thought they'd be. And you and others in Congress, there's been this kind of undercurrent drifting through Congress that maybe there's a chance to recalibrate the relationship that we have with China in regard to Russia. Do you think there's some opening now that this conflict in Ukraine may have exposed Russia and that China may not want to be as cozy with them?
I actually think we have to be very careful about what China is doing. If anything, I believe you'll see China trying to, at some point, help Russia. And I don't know by what means that is going to exist, whether it's economic or just transference of military hardware. But I think what it does expose is what China really is. China is just an autocratic country that doesn't really care about the capitalism, just cares about power. And I think it's going to be really important for us to recognize what happens there. We're taking away our favorite trade status from Russia. It'll happen hopefully by next week. And at some point, maybe we have to also look at where we stand versus China. China has been just as aggressive against us, spying on us, hacking our systems. And if they end up backing Russia, I think there needs to be a really good conversation about what our economic relationships are with a country that is backing our enemies. It doesn't really make much sense for us to cut off oil from Russia and trade from Russia so they wouldn't, be able to pay for their war. Then why are we doing the same for China, who's going to help pay for the Russian war? Again, we're not at that point yet, but it's something that we should actually understand.
I'm glad you brought up the oil situation. I've got to ask you, because I know you believe in green energy and transitioning to green energy. But I think there is kind of an awakening going on around the world, particularly in Europe and certainly in the United States, that right now we can't run this economy on renewables. We simply can't. It's only 12%. Solar and wind energy is only 12% of what we need. We're just not there. Yet, because of this reliance on Russian oil, particularly in Europe, they can't get there, cutting off Russian oil, and this is funding his war machine. This is insane.
Well, look, I think there are a couple of things. Number one, we have to separate oil from gas and from electricity generation. We don't power our homes with oil. Now, Europe does use liquid natural gas from Russia, and this is why we're working with them to diversify where they get that. So some of that's going to come from the United States, some of that's going to come from our Gulf partners such as Qatar. So they're not reliant on Russia. Number two, I think it was a mistake for Germany and some Western European countries for them to also shut off their nuclear power plants without them having some type of replacement. That's not a very smart
Totally
energy
agree
policy.
with you. And there's a lesson for us here in the United States. If you're worried about greenhouse gases but energizing the country, nuclear is maybe our best option. Nuclear and clean natural gas.
So I've been a very big proponent of nuclear. I do think it's a very clean method for us to generate power. Obviously, we have to be doing a very safe manner. I do think we still also need to diversify our economy when it comes to how it's being powered. When it comes to our vehicles, there's two things. Number one, continue moving forward with the electric vehicle changes that we're going through our country. And number two, look, we have lots of oil leases that are out there that are still standing there. What we don't have is actually corporations that are willing to make the investment right now. And here's the reason why.
The banks and others are telling them, look, we're being told, you're not in favor. We don't want to fund your projects. And environmental regulations through the EPA and others are slowing this stuff down. It's not that
these
they don't want to
regulations
drill.
have always been there. The problem right now is like the price of oil is finally down, but the price of gasoline has not. A lot of these oil companies are trying to recoup a lot of costs that they lost during the COVID pandemic, and instead of passing on the savings to consumers, they're passing on to their shareholders. Look, if they want to tap and they want to start, there are thousands of leases out there already. Get going, drill. I don't care, but don't use that as an excuse to go and get further leases that you're just going to sit on. And that's the thing I think aggravates a lot of people, is that oil companies right now are just basically making money, but they're not actually producing the energy and the savings that we need right now for everyday Americans.
Let me throw one more at you, the border. We are still in the situation where the border is porous. I mean, you've talked about this. Even Mark Kelly, who's running again for Senate, he says, we have got a crisis on our southern border. And he says, I also think this is a national security issue. Do you share that feeling?
Well, it's definitely a crisis. Look, there's no way that any country can look at thousands of people a day crossing and not saying that's a problem. The question is, what do we do about it? I think there's multiple ways we have to deal with this. Number one, we have to reform immigration process so people can come here legally. Number two, I do think that at the border right now, we have to send more judges so we could quickly decide who actually has the right to be a refugee. Not everyone that comes here to the United States has a right to claim to be a refugee and or get asylum status. And instead of waiting for months for that to be decided, I think you could do that at the border. Hopefully within a day or two when somebody arrives here.
That's at least one step we can
pressure.
Yeah, I appreciate it. We're out of time, Congressman Gallego. Thank you so much for joining us from D.C. and we'll have you back. Thank you.
Have a good one.
Great to see you. Thanks. When we come back on Newsmaker Saturday, Phoenix Police Chief Jeri Williams on the problems of trying to recruit in the midst of her officers being ambushed several times in the last couple of months. We're back in a minute. Back on Newsmaker Saturday, in the past several months, 7 Phoenix police officers have been shot, 13 overall have been injured. There is something going on out on the streets, not only in Phoenix, but in this country. Chief Jeri Williams going on 6 years as chief of one of the largest police agencies, not only in the state of Arizona, it is the largest, but one of the largest in the country. Chief, thanks for being with us. I appreciate it.
So thanks for having me on Saturday, John.
Chief Williams, you've got to be worn out by this. This is, I don't want to call it an epidemic, but what else do you call it?
So I call it a brutalized attack on the men and women who stand in the gap between good and bad, who have a heart and passion to serve. I will say this has been a tough couple of years for us as the Phoenix Police Department and for law enforcement in general. But our employees are resilient, and when I look on the faces of employees who may not have been involved in the critical incident, seeing the fact that their willingness and their determination to continue to answer those calls for service or respond as a communications officer or a crime scene tech really makes me proud to be a Phoenix police officer.
Let's take the 27th Avenue officer-involved shooting. We're going to run the video. I believe these two were related. They're brothers. And does this appear to be a situation where one of them guided the other? He was running from police, guided the other into a situation where the brother in this complex could shoot at officers. Is that what happened here?
So based on the, thank you, based on the information that we know at the time, it appears to be the same. You actually mentioned ambushes, so we can go back to the incident on Warner where 9 of my employees were injured, 5 were shot. We can take that a step back to the Tyler Moldavon shooting back in December. So that's an ambush type. This, by all accounts, appears to be the same. They're still running some of the information in the investigative process, but it does appear to be the same.
Chief, is this a shift? I mean, you're talking to law enforcement all around the country. Are we seeing some kind of shift where the line of not this kind of stuff, it seems like we've crossed some kind of invisible line where people are just, there is no hesitation to fire on an officer?
Right. It's a very disturbing trend. What I will say to you, John, in talking to a lot of the police chiefs across the country, if you talk to folks in Texas, you talk to folks in New York, you talk to folks in D.C., and we're seeing this happen across the country. So as I mentioned on some previous interviews, this is a very disturbing trend. It's a trend that the community should not be behind, that we should all be speaking volumes towards the fact that people who are here to serve are being shot at, and at times in other parts across the country,
Chief,
through sorrow, killed.
Do you believe that some of the rhetoric following George Floyd and his tragic killing in Minneapolis, do you believe that some of the rhetoric against police has kind of dissolved that line that I just mentioned, where somehow in the criminal's mind, they're like, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to shoot at the officer. I don't care. They're bad guys.
So,
is there something going on psychologically?
So I am not a psychologist or anyone in the mental health field. What I will say is I can tell you what's happening by experience. So the two individuals who shot, the individual who shot Tyler as well as the individual who shot the 9 officers, they both had previous histories of violent offenses. And I think we as a society need to look at that pattern in order to make sure that before an incident like this happens to the young woman who was killed on the Warner incident and Tyler, who's recovering out of state and has a long road to recovery, we need to look at how that pattern is playing out and what we as a society can do about that. I
want to go to the Warner, you mentioned it, the Warner shooting. This was the officer-involved shooting. 10 officers, I believe, were wounded, injured in various ways. This is so cold and calculating. The guy's in the doorway with the weapon behind his left hip. He urges the officer to come in because a woman inside is bleeding, choking on her blood, he says. And he opens fire. I mean, this is an absolute ambush.
Right. So when we looked at the initial body-worn camera video that night, that morning, that was some of the most chilling video that I've seen in a long time. And I've been a police officer today, 33 years today to be exact. So when you see that kind of callous nature as the officer is coming in to try to provide help and assistance, those are things, again, that we as a society need to look at. And as previously mentioned, those individuals had previous violent offenses, previous gun offenses. So we as a society really need to look long and hard at that.
I mean, do you have any answers as to why this is happening?
I don't have any answers as to why it's happening. I do know this, though. Even though and in spite of all those situations and circumstances that happen, I still have men and women who answer calls for service, John. I still have people who take calls for service as communications operators. And I think the resiliency and the resolve to serve has not wavered whatsoever with the men and women who work with me.
How about recruiting, Chief? I know you're incentivizing people to try to join the force. I think it's up to $7,500 just to sign on, right?
Yes.
You're doing what you can. What are you hearing from recruits? Are you able to find people, or is there resistance now, particularly with recruits of color, which has always been a challenge?
Right. So fortunately for us, this past weekend, we had one of the largest recruitments, largest incidents where we have individuals coming in to take the written test. We had over 70 people over this past weekend. That's been the most that we've had, gosh, in the last 2 years.
Wow.
So thankfully, the incentive that was given to us by mayor and council is paying off. Also, a raise to officers is paying off. But we always look at, John, we always look at that sworn side. We're also hiring on the civilian side of the house, too. So I don't know if you know this, but mayor and council authorized us to be able to hire civilian investigators.
Yes, I do know
and
this.
Police assistants, which are going to be like a great augmentation to patrol. We had over 400 people apply for the civilian investigator position, and over 150 people apply for the police assistant position. So we're making headway in our recruitment efforts. I believe in part it's us connecting with the community to include communities of color to make sure that we're trying to create a police department that mirrors a community we serve.
Chief, have you had a chance to meet with Roger Smith? He is the new director of Office of Accountability and Transparency. He's been on the job for about a month. He will be overseeing this new office. It's going to review police incidents. Have you had a chance to talk with him, sit down with him?
So I've had a chance to meet with him and speak with him. He is building up his bureau. I've said this before, John, and I'll say it again. I'm not afraid of transparency. I'm not afraid of another set of eyes looking at what we do as a police department. That's part of transparency, and that's part of accountability.
Does that stretch to the Department of Justice, which opened that civil rights investigation into Phoenix PD back in August?
So I would say no. We were looking at building the Office of Accountability and Transparency long before DOJ made its way towards the Phoenix Police Department. So we were already down that path as a city. Mayor and council voted on that, and as I said that evening that they voted on it, and I'll keep saying again, I'm not afraid of accountability and transparency and another set of eyes.
When it comes to DOJ, are you talking to those people actively? What are they doing? This has been very quiet what they're doing. We don't know a lot
So
about what the DOJ is doing.
Well, what we know is that they are going to be on site in the future. They have been bogged down by COVID restrictions and COVID regulations, but they have been constantly investigating and asking for various information and information sources so that they can continue their investigation. So it's been quiet because they've not been able to be present because of COVID convictions, but they do have some visits coming up.
Chief, what's the relationship right now with mayor and council? Do you feel like they're supporting you?
So I will say I've always felt support from mayor and council regardless. So I have routine and regular conversations with them. I've set up monthly meetings with them. We talk about issues going on in the police department. John, you should know this about me. I'm not going to look for the negative. I'm always going to look for taking the high road. I'm always going to look for the positivity. And as I mentioned before, mayor and council approved the $7,500 incentive. Mayor and council approved raises for our officers. So my relationship is working well with mayor and council. I'm the professional, they're professionals, we work well together.
No, you've always been a happy warrior. And I've got to ask you something personally. I know you never want to make this about you, but you've been there now 6 years. I think the average tenure now for a chief in this country is 2.5 to 3 years in a big city. You're at 6. How much longer, you just mentioned, you just hit your 33rd year today.
Yes.
How much longer do you want to do this?
You know, that's the $1 million question. So if you speak to any major city chief across the country, and I'm connected with them, I'm part of the Major City Chiefs Association, we all know that there is a quote-unquote shelf life for police chiefs. But as long as I feel as though I'm being effective, as long as we're making sure we're moving forward as a police department, I'll remain in this chair. When it comes time for me to go, I'll know when that time is. And I won't be afraid to leave and let someone take this baton and run with it.
So, average tenure for a police chief in a major city now is, as I mentioned, 2.5 to 3 years. 40 years ago, it was double that. Do you have any sense of why that would be? What's changed?
So a lot has changed. So the policing part of the job is the same. People call, they want you to problem solve, that's what happens. Some of the different dynamics, I think social media has definitely played a big part in this. And someone who's willing to tolerate and take all the things that come in as a police chief. You have members of the public questioning what you do. You have some of your employees questioning what you do. It takes a special resilience and a special resolve to remain in this position. At the same time, being willing to constantly listen, constantly evolve, constantly change. And you just really have to find the right personalities for this. At the end of the day, you're still going to need police chiefs wherever we are in this country because we're going to need police officers and police employees. It's really working on how to manage all the different dynamics that come in as a police chief and still be focused and positive on doing the job.
One more thing on this slate of ambushes that we've had on police officers. Is there anything that you've seen that might change the training protocol going into situations? And I particularly think about the Warner Street officer-involved shooting where the guy was hiding behind the door with a weapon, urging the officer to come inside and help him, and then he pulls a gun on him. I mean, do you need to go now with guns drawn into these situations, even when you're trying to de-escalate in the environment we're currently in politically?
So I would not agree with that sentiment by any stretch of the imagination. What I would say is this: I want my men and women to be safe. I want them to safely approach. They want to come in and problem solve. With each incident and situation that we have, we always review what's going on to see what we can do to mitigate the scenario and situation, make sure the employee is safe, make sure that the community members are safe. And we'll do that with the Warner shooting as well as all the other ones too. So we're always adjusting our training and our tactics in order to meet what we are being faced with, and this won't be anything different.
Do you think Warner does change things in some regard? Do you think it may change how you approach a suspect, a house? So
I would say I'm going to wait for our tactical detail to come to that resolve once they review the entire incident. What we're trying to make sure that we do on a couple of fronts, we really want our officers to be safe. We want the folks on the other side of the call to get all the information possible and to make the safest decisions possible, not just for the officers, but for our community members.
Chief Jeri Williams, great to see you. Thank you so much.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Chief Jeri Williams, we're back in a moment on Newsmaker Saturday.